Welcome everybody. I notice we've got a decent attendance today, and I look forward to hearing your comments as we talk about the quail forecast. So if you have any questions, as Clint said, please indicate them down in the question box, and we'll try to have time towards the end of the hour to where we can spend some time with Q&A. In the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, it defines a Jubilee year, which happens every 49th or 50th year, depending on who you talk to. But I'll say every 50 years, a Jubilee year was declared, and that basically meant that slaves were freed, all bills were canceled, and the land was returned to people. So it was a great blessing to those people. And in many respects, we're having what I'd call a Jubilee year. We're shaping up for a Jubilee year this year with our quail forecast. So this is going to be, it should be good news for you, I think, most of you. Just to give you an idea of where we're going to go in the next hour, I'll talk about the regional status as based upon some historical accounts. I'll go through my idea as far as what some prospects will be for the 2015-16 hunting season. Talk a little bit about the factors involved that kind of brought about the perfect storm this year for quail. And then I will pass the question to you about, can we sustain it? Right now we've got populations building. Can we sustain them? Because nothing makes you appreciate quail more than the last 7 or 8 years. So can we do something with what we've got? Several times I've spoken to the TWA crowd and various webinars and so forth, and generally I always show this slide because until this year, this has been one of those slides that just kind of haunts us, the fact that our populations have been in the doldrums really since about 2009, and there hasn't been much to cheer about. But this year, hopefully we won't see a lot of bird dogs with sad faces and quail hunters with sad faces. I think we're in store for something much better. So I hope you still have a dog. I know a lot of you have told me that over the last 5 or 6 years your dog passed on and you haven't bought back in, but you may regret that decision this year. Periodically through today's session, I'll give you a little quiz just to make sure that you're following along and engaged. And so this is a quiz question number 1. Where is this sign located? Is it in Aspermont, Hebbronville, Memphis, Roby, or Turkey? And Clint, if you will bring up the poll.
You may have to make this one a rhetorical question. I'm experiencing more technical difficulties.
Okay. Well, I'll give them a few minutes to discuss it, phone a friend, and then I'll give them the answer here in about 3 seconds. And to find out how many of you have traveled to Memphis, Texas. That's along U.S. Highway 287, pointing off to the east to the little community of Quail, Texas, which is located in Collingsworth County. So now let's become a student of history for a minute, and let's look back over the last 30 years or so of what the quail populations have done in various parts of Texas. And these next 2 slides will be based on Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's roadside counts. So they do these in late July. It's a 20-mile route, or some counties will have several routes. And they conduct these in about 7 of the 10 ecoregions of Texas, basically everywhere but the eastern third of Texas. If you're not familiar with these, you can go to Parks and Wildlife's website, go to the quail forecast. They haven't released their statewide quail counts yet. I suspect that'll be coming up probably in about the next 3 weeks. I have been privy to see one district's response, and it was pretty good. So I may make some comments towards that a little bit later. But if you haven't seen that, you may want to click in on that and find the data for your particular region when that forecast comes out. Okay, let's start off with the rolling plains, and I'm going to point out a couple of things here on the graph itself. The y-axis is not constant from ecoregion to ecoregion. The rolling plains, which has the highest long-term mean, it goes up to 50. The green line represents the long-term mean, or that's the average of roughly 26 years worth of counts that they've done. And you'll notice, basically in all of them, that the quail population goes up and down in what we call an eruptive population for the most part. So just be aware that, again, the numbers there, I'll go through the other regions. But one thing I want you to pay attention to is something in about the 1994 time frame. Again, I'm showing it here for the rolling plains, but I don't have it highlighted in these subsequent slides, but just in your mind, ask what's going on about 1994 and thereafter, because quail populations have had a tough time, as this graph shows, they've had a tough time breaking the long-term mean in the rolling plains. They should do it, or at least approach it this year, if numbers that I'm hearing coming in are correct. So we should see a nice improvement. But if you think, or if you have some idea of what happened in about that 1994 time frame, I'm always open. My ears are open, my antennae are up. I would like your input on what you think might have changed about that time frame. Because as you see, for example, here in South Texas, again, 1994, something seemed to knock the bottom out of them, and they've had a hard time coming back. Again, South Texas population, boom and bust, eruptive. Again, based on my personal experience from last week, I had the opportunity to tour several ranches down in South Texas last week, and it looked like they're going to be above the mean line of the long-term mean this year. So, going to be pretty good reports from South Texas. Cross Timbers is the third ecoregion. As far as the long-term mean is about 12. Now, the numbers go up to 40 here on the y-axis. But since about 1994, not much to report from the Cross Timbers. I'll give you some anecdotal reports of some sightings and so forth. But quail hunting, as a rule, is out of the game in the Cross Timbers area. The Gulf Prairies and Marshes is the next one. Long-term mean of about 10 birds per route. Note over here that it's really the only ecoregion in Texas over the last 3 or 4 years that's seen an increase. And if you think about how badly we busted in the rolling plains and in South Texas, the Trans-Pecos areas, you got to ask what's going on over here in the Gulf Prairies and Marshes. And it may be that the same factors that were hurting us in West and South Texas, i.e. a 3-year drought, actually helped down in the Gulf Coast. That area still got 25 inches of rain or so. The average might be 50, but some people speculate 2 things that I've heard. One is less flooding of nests, which can be a real problem down there in that part of the world in a wet year. And then some people speculate that it pushed the fire ants underground somewhat and may have given the quail nest some relief from that source of mortality. Edwards Plateau, long-term mean of about 6 birds per route. And again, since about 1994, it's struggled to get above the mean line. The High Plains, about 4 birds per route. And again, I had an opportunity to get an unofficial look at some of the Parks and Wildlife projections from this area, and I think you're going to see a nice rebound based on those numbers for the High Plains area. So it's going to be a pretty strong rebound for the High Plains at least. Okay, and I'll just show blue quail. You can look at the several ecoregions for blue quail, but I'm just going to call up the rolling plains for this one. And again, before 1994, this one happened in about 1988. The blue quail busted, and as a rule, have been at very low levels since that time. Blue quail, I am getting reports that blue quail have come on pretty strong in the western part of their range, and seeing blue quail in some areas further east. All right. Get on with my forecast now. If I take my crystal ball, I'm seeing a lot of people standing in line over the next 2 weeks at the sporting goods counters, obviously to get their loaded up for dove season, get their annual hunting license and so forth. But I see a lot of shotgun shells being sold this year, upland game loads. So I'm going to be talking about 7.5s, 8s, and 9s. And for the most part, my projections, my forecasts are not scientific. They're based on anecdotes that I receive. I have a list of about probably 70 people that I send out. I call it my quail trap line. And so about a month ago, I sent emails out to those individuals asking them to rate what they think their forecast is going to be or what they think their hunting is going to be on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being pitiful and 10 being wow. And so we'll see some of those numbers here in just a second. But to each and every person, when they send me their forecast, they'll basically make some comment like, if the wheels don't fall off. There are no old, bold quail forecasters. And when we just about the time we think we've got it figured out, well, a year like 2010 comes along, when at this time of the year we felt pretty good about our quail numbers, but then come hunting season, it was whoa. So again, a lot of things, confidence level in my forecasters needs a boost, and again, we're hoping that this year they get that boost. I've listed 4 shot sizes here, ranging from 6, 7.5, 8s, and 9s, and that's basically what my quail forecasts are going to consist of. So I'll show you a shotgun shell box and then talk about the area that is projecting that type of forecast for the upcoming season. 7.5s, I'm going to say, and again, don't take these outlines literally. That's just a general area of the state. Certainly you may have an area right here that's well above or well below what I'm telling you right now. So take this with a grain of salt, just general areas. But in this western part of the rolling plains, the Bobwhite forecast, I'm going to say is about a 7.5. That's what I would give the outlook for the rolling plains quail research ranch, about a 7.5. On a good day, maybe an 8. The green areas here would be 8s, and 8s come from a couple of areas. Most of this west of the Pecos, getting really good reports from the Permian Basin and west of the Pecos on blue quail. The eastern half or 2/3 of the Panhandle, the eastern part of the rolling plains here. This is an area that's basically gone offline several years ago, but some fairly strong reports coming in there. And then kind of the northern part of South Texas is giving me a pretty good rating too. So general areas, generally good forecast. I have a strip of 9s that were reported to me, and that's roughly from the eastern part of the rolling plains up and down Highway 83 kind of thing. Right in here from roughly San Angelo up to about almost south of Childress, something like that. 9's hard to beat, but there are a couple of areas that are sending me some even higher numbers. And since I couldn't come up with number 10 shot from a forecast, well, I got to assume most of you that are tuned in are my age, which is 60 years old or older, if you're an avid quail hunter, and you're 98% male. So I've got to think that when you think of a 10, you think of a movie back in the late 70s called 10, starring Bo Derek. And so I'll use her iconic image to talk about 2 areas, the largest of which is in South Texas. And again, I don't know just exactly how broad that area, how broad a net to cast down there. I was down in the Hebronville area last week, and again, saw several places that were almost on fire, figuratively speaking, with quail. We saw a lot of, if we were touring in the morning, we saw a lot of quail down there. So forecasting I'm getting, I had at least 3 forecasters, and these people have some fairly good tenure to them. They're anywhere from 10 years in the game up to one of them 35 years in the game, and they're giving it 10. So it's a pretty special year, it looks like, down in deep South Texas. The other area that I've got several 10s from is this area just east of San Angelo, Runnels, Concho County, a couple of reports of 10 in that part of the world too. So some outstanding hunting in store in certain areas. Now, I'm not going to go into the details. Again, I've got a lot of text that I gleaned from my quail trap line. I'll be reporting that in much more detail in the September issue of the eQuail newsletter. So if you're not a member, or if you don't get that, it's a free eQuail newsletter from the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch. I invite you to attend at quailresearch.org, and you can find out more about that. Clint, I'm just checking with you. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yes, it's working good.
Okay.
It seems to come and go, but I can hear you. But the polling is not going to work. I don't know where the glitch is.
Okay, I just see one chat down there from Chris that says he can't hear. Oh, can't hear me or can't hear you. All right, I'm assuming everybody else can, so we'll move on. Now the quiz question, checking the age of some of you. What gauge of shot shell is this? 10 gauge, 12 gauge, 16 gauge, or 28 gauge? And since the polling apparatus is on the fritz, I won't dwell on it too long, but that's a 16 gauge shell. And if you're like me, you might have shot a 16 gauge earlier in your career. Let's move into the next session now, next part of this webinar, and that's basically the question I get as much as anything. phone calls, emails. They're so glad that they're seeing quail, but then the follow-up question is, where did they come from? And so let's look at several possibilities that could have resulted in this oftentimes miraculous quail response. A lot of people will suggest to you that the rain brought quail spores. And again, I'm being fictitious here, but it's almost as spontaneous generation in some areas. So we know that we're going to dispel the idea of quail spores in the rain. So that leaves us with at least three other hypotheses. One is dispersal. In other words, if we've got those areas that still held fairly good quail numbers, the honey holes as I might call them, something may have prompted those birds to pick up and go walk about and move some fairly long distances. Bobwhite coveys have been known to move about 35 miles in western Oklahoma. Blue quail individuals have been known to travel up to 65 miles. We don't know how often that happens. We don't know how big a factor that is. Anybody that's done any radio telemetry will tell you that you're going to lose 10% or so of your radios, whether or not those are birds that just literally get away from you, go further than you can find them, or whether it's radio malfunction is debatable. Another hypothesis is what I call smoldering embers. There were always some quail left in low numbers in the background. They were rigged for silent running in submarine jargon. They weren't going to bring any attention to themselves, but when the conditions were right, well, they were ready to rock and roll. And so I suspect dispersal and smoldering embers were a big part of the miraculous rebound. But you can't rule out the fact there's been a lot of pin-reared quail released in Texas. We really don't have a clue how many. Some estimates would have 4 or 5 million a year. And some of those birds do survive, and some of them do reproduce. So it's possible that, again, with a good year like we've had, it could be some of those. So we've got several factors that could be at play resulting in what we've seen, especially in areas east of roughly Highway 83, Highway 281, something like that. All right, let's look at obviously one of the big factors, and probably the largest factor, is the weather that we've seen over the last 6 months or so. It's obviously turned dry. We're very dry here in San Angelo. I know some of y'all are getting some moisture today. It passed us by. Really, we had wonderful rains March, April, May, June. Then it shut off about the 5th of July. We hadn't had any since that time. But the season was, or the quail production was pretty well sealed at that time for us. And if the wheels don't fall off, our numbers look pretty good. Rainfall can be obviously very important. Dr. Guthrie down in South Texas used to say it. Rainfall accounted for about 45% of the annual variation in quail abundance. And then about 6-7 years ago, the Cesar Kleberg Institute did some work and looked at some of their Quail Associates data that they collect in South Texas, and they saw that 93% of the variability in age ratios, juvenile to adult ratios, could be explained by April through August precipitation. So that's a very powerful driver. They were quick to point out that on well-managed habitat. But when you get the kind of rains of Jubilee Year like we've had this year, as one of my colleagues would say, even the poor people are going to have quail. So it talks again just about what a driving force certainly well-timed rainfall can bring. But who accounts for the rest? If we go back over to Dr. Guthrie's idea of about 50% of it being attributed to rainfall, we've got to appreciate that our management has some impact. And I'll touch on this as we get close to the end of the webinar. We'll be thinking again about, is there something that we can implement to help hopefully sustain the populations that we're going to be seeing this winter? What a difference 3 years makes, 4 years actually. This is the modified Palmer Drought Index for July 2011. And this is the same index for July of 2015. Dark purple equals exceptional drought. 2011 being a terrible year for quail. Here at San Angelo, we had 100 days of above 100-degree temperature. We wound up at the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch here in Fisher County with about 8.5 inches rain, but only 2.5 of that coming before October the 8th of that year. And then contrast that again with the situation here. This is basically a running average of what the moisture conditions have been for over a 3-month period. Green is good, maroon not good. That's the take-home message there. Several years ago, I pulled together the annual precipitation data from Abilene. Everybody knows where Abilene's located here. Average precipitation being about 24 inches. And again, erratic, chaotic types of precipitation. But if we look back at some of the really good quail years, for example, the first one that I would say I could remember would probably be in this one right here, about 1970-71. We see that if we look for those peak rainfall years, we should be able to say, well, we had a pretty good quail year. So in 1987 was kind of the benchmark of my generation, again in about 91 or 92. And then 2005 was a good quail year. We had, this stops at 2009, but we had about this much rainfall in 2010. We didn't see any quail response. And that one's just what I call a quail enigma. Here's the Bobwhite Trans again. I'll just use this graph from the rolling plains to talk about a couple of terms. These were boom years, and we now recognize those. We didn't talk about El Nino and La Nina until roughly 5 years ago. But that El Nino weather pattern, that southern oscillation, those oceanic temperatures out there in the equator do have very strong influences on our precipitation. As quail hunters, as ranchers, we much prefer the El Nino condition, which means El Nino equals El Grino for us here in Texas. And so we're enjoying an El Nino situation, or have for the last several months. Our quail populations in the rolling plains and in the high plains actually satisfy the conditions for being cyclic. The one in South Texas, not as much, and more eruptive. But in Texas, about in the rolling plains, high plains, about every 5 years. And again, we know that El Nino is about on a 5-year cycle. We see those kind of responses. And then I've got a question mark over here at 2010 because we were due for an El Nino, and we had fairly good summer precipitation, but no quail response. I had a lot of email chats with Dr. Guthrie several years ago about quail population dynamics, and I'm paraphrasing him here. But he said, show me 3 years of successively good rainfall and the quail will be back in good numbers. As I recall, he said all the way back to Fort Worth, and I doubted that at the time, and maybe questioned a little bit, but as I'll show you, or as you'll hear from reports from that area, you know there are birds popping up in that cross timbers area. So what are the odds of getting those 3 years of successfully good rainfall? Well, over the last 125 years at Abilene, there were 4 times when 3 or more successive rainfall years were observed, those being, I don't think any of you are old enough to remember that one. Very few of you will be old enough to remember that one. That one, many of you might remember, again, after the drought broke in 1957. And if you talk to guys that I learned to quail hunt from, they talk about how many bobwhites there were in 1958 and how basically they were in every inch of habitat, and even in the roadside ditches and suburbs and everything else kind of thing. But keep in mind, it was a wet period right in there. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, again, 4 years of successively good rainfall. Do you remember these climatological facts for Texas? 10 out of 13 years, 57 to 69 were above average years. So a lot of people harken back what was going on in the 60s, but again, that was a wet decade. 10 out of 12 years in the late 40s and early 50s were below average years. A 3-year wet period occurs on average about every 27 years, and it's been 23 years since our last such spell. Last year for us here in the Rolling Plains was an average year. At the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch, we were right at our annual average of 21 inches. We're at 22 inches right now, so we're already exceeding our average. And as I'll talk later about the long-range forecast, it looks like we may be due for that 3rd year of good rainfall next year. We'll be due for that 3rd one, or we'll be due for that 3 years stretch for the next one, statistically speaking, in about 2019. Hope to set that forward a couple of years. Here's the rainfall records for the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch through July. And again, you can see that we've had above average, the bluish line here represents the 30-year average. We were above average in, right at average in March, above average in April, wonderful May, wonderful June. Spigot turned off in July, and we haven't had much rain since that time. But given the rains were timely, and the same way across most of the quail range in Texas, and probably if you can get about 18 to 20 inches of timely precipitation, you can do pretty well for bobwhite, such as maybe 14 inches for blue quail. One of the people that I've always been impressed with his work, he's one of the great naturalists in the quail world, passed on several years ago, A.S. Jackson. His career was with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. His opus magnum was a little handbook called the Quail Management Handbook for West Texas Rolling Plains, and you can still get a copy of that from Texas Parks and Wildlife's website. Really good read, a very wonderful explanation of plant succession. And Jackson wrote a paper in 1964, I believe, 61, I believe, where he talked about a pattern to the eruptions of quail in the rolling plains. And he broke it into a 5-year process, or a 5-step process. First of all, you enter the cycle where drought sets the stage. We're coming into an area where coming into a time frame we've had a couple of years of successive dry weather, basically a lot of bare ground, so you kind of turn the clock back on succession. At the end of a 2-year drought, your cattle numbers are probably down, so everything is poised for that rain. When the drought breaks, there are always a few quail out there in some of the honey holes. They've had a little refugia out there in places, and once you begin to see those quail kind of breaking out of those honey holes and occupying more of the landscape, Jackson calls that a lateral increase. And so now we've got breeding capital in many areas across the landscape. If we get a second good year of rain, then we get a broomweed crop. And that's what we're looking at right now, as I'll show you later. And you also have what he'd call a vertical increase. So first we got to fill up the habitat with quail, and then you get a vertical increase. And we're on the verge, or in some areas we're seeing that vertical increase right now. Another year, if we happen to get another good year, well, then grasses begin to crowd out some of the sunflowers, the broomweed, that kind of thing, what Val Lehman would call unstable utopia. We're not going to be able to keep it like that. So if we're going to a couple of better years rainfall-wise, the country's going to change some, and then succession may go a little too far to the right to be optimal for quail. But about the time we think we get there, well, then drought sets back in and resets the cycle like that. I would just add my interpretation to Jackson's comments. I like to say that drought cocks the hammer and rain pulls the trigger. And again, think back to what the country looked like in 2011, 2012, a lot of bare ground. When we get those rains, and especially when we get fall rains here in the rolling plains, we get a lot of broomweed. And I'm probably broomweed's biggest fan. There are 2 plants that I champion that a lot of my friends and colleagues don't appreciate. One of them is broomweed, and the other one's prickly pear. But if you've weathered the drought, and the cactus is very important to you for nesting cover, and then a year like broomweed, I just say that nothing insulates a quail crop better than a canopy of broomweed. So here's a good example. This is a photograph of some blue quail at the Quail Research Ranch last month. I had a game camera sitting out, and 54 blue quail in that covey. So I use this one, and you can see the dense broomweed on either side of the 2-track road there. I just like to always tip my cap, if you will, to common broomweed with this pledge. If we were in the field, I'd have you breaking off a broomweed and holding it over your head as you recited this. I pledge allegiance to common broomweed and to the cover for which it provides. One canopy over quail, continuous, providing usable space for bobwhites. It helps insulate the quail from the various predators. If you're in a dense canopy of broomweed, to a quail it's like a covered shopping mall, but to a northern harrier up here it's impenetrable. So it provides a lot of value. It also provides a seed, which the broomweed is just now beginning to flower, but it'll be producing a seed, tiny seed, but it's a sunflower. It's in the sunflower family. It's oil-rich seed, and quail will be eating a lot of that later on this winter. If you got broomweed, be thankful. So what is it about rain? I mean, what's magical about the rain? Is there a silver bullet that rain brings? Well, it actually brings a whole revolver, a cylinder full of silver bullets. If you get rain in the fall, one of the things it does, again, I'll speak from experience here in the rolling plains. We'll try to extrapolate to other areas. But if we get rains in October, November, we get a lot of winter greens. Typically that's fillery. We have a couple species of fillery. Quail love fillery. Tallow-weed, plantains, they love quail. Eat quite a bit of salad, and especially salad greens in the late winter. Some people speculate that that primes the reproductive pump for the fall and spring. I think there's probably something to it. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is. A wet summer is a cooler summer, and a cooler summer means we can extend the nesting season. And when it gets hot like it has here in the Roman Plains over the last 5 weeks, our nesting season is coming to a close pretty quick. I mean, if we could have gotten a 3-inch rain yesterday, we could have probably kick-started that back and had some more nesting. But if we don't get some rains pretty quick here in the northern half of Texas, the nesting season will be basically over. Down in South Texas, y'all can still have birds hatching off until November kind of time frame. So again, cooler year equals a longer nesting season. Nesting cover. Nesting cover, we think of a little blue stem. We think that's the archetypical nest clump, but a lot of different species can accommodate that. And the biggest thing about nesting cover is you don't want that nesting cover, that nesting clump that a bird selects, you don't want it to stick out from the surroundings. If I have one clump of little blue stem out there among 100 acres, the quail will be foolish to nest in it. It's going to stick out. So you want to blend in. So we want nesting cover across the landscape. That's one of the things that moisture does for us, increase the amount of nesting cover. As a result, and again with the broomweed that it brings on, we probably see better survival, not only of our adults, but possibly with their chicks. Buffer prey species. Predation is a powerful factor in the life of quail, and if we can add more things out there, that things like coyotes, bobcats, Cooper's hawks, any of those can prey. Typically, most predators are opportunistic. They're going to take whatever's easiest to catch. If we can make that cotton rats rather than quail, we're probably better off, and that's what we're seeing this year. And again, a rising tide raises all ships. So when the jackrabbits come back, well, that's indicative that the quail are on the right track. We've got buku roadrunners this year, but it means we've got buku insects and a lot of other things. So rain's good on a lot of fronts. Share with you some of the observations we're seeing up at the RPQRR. We have nesting cover across the landscape. If you read Texas Wildlife Association's newsletter, a couple 3 months ago, I talked about the concept of thimble rigging, which is basically just a shell and marble game at the carnival. And the point is that if there's 3 nuts or 3 shells and 1 pea, you're going to lose 2/3 of the time. The carny's going to win. Imagine what the odds would be if there's 300 shells and just 1 pea. So we're taking the counter thought to that. If we're a nesting hen, we want to have at least 300 suitable nest sites per acre if we want to have decent nest success. That's what our recommendation is. We're seeing hatch rates above 70%. Until about 3 weeks ago, our hatch rates were in the 80s and the low 90s for blue quail. Since that time, over the last several weeks, have been depredated and dropped out. But 70%, the national average is 28% for bobwhites. Anything above 50% nest success you're proud of. We're seeing some incredibly high hatch rates, probably record hatch rates this year. Also got that broomweed canopy I talked about. Broomweed canopy, again, it's been dense, and again, it provides that covered shopping mall for quail to move around in, and with relative impunity to their many of their predators. Getting reports, we've seen a lot of these, and I'm hearing it from a lot of other areas, mega broods. We're defining a mega brood as anything with over 25 birds in it. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe 25% of the coveys, maybe 30% of the coveys that I'm seeing at the RPQ are 20 to 25 bird coveys. So we've had some really good production and apparently some very good brood survival. There are a number of different ways that can happen. There's about 4 different combinations of ways. I'm not going to go into those. If you'll look at the June issue of the eQuail newsletter, it talks about what some of those are. At least at RPQR, based on our photo trapping, our camera traps, we have relatively low mesocarnivore abundance. When I say mesocarnivore specifically, I'm talking about raccoons and skunks. We're not catching any of them on our cameras right now. Whether or not the raccoon numbers are down anywhere else, I'll be open for discussion on that. Whether or not that is a function of distemper or something else going through the raccoon population, I'm not sure. I'm not lamenting the absence or the relative absence of raccoons, because they're one of our more significant nest predators. And then here at the research ranch again, when we fly helicopter counts, we fly counts as one of our ways to count quail. We do that in March, and we do it in November. And when we were flying our counts in March, we were seeing rats from the air, cotton rats, the common pasture rats. I'd never seen that in a helicopter count. And so I was already beginning to think about what a good year this could be back in March when I saw all those rats in there, because a cotton rat is basically a bobwhite with fur. And when we brought our interns in this summer, we trapped small mammals as an index of what's going on out there in January and in in June. And our June numbers, and you can look at the July issue of eQuail for a full report on this, cotton rats had exploded on the research ranch. And again, based upon some information out of Tall Timbers area down in Florida and southern Georgia, we think if we see a good population of rats, that's a good thing for quail. And if you're a quail hunter of long tenure, you can probably remember a rat year. The last rat year I can remember is 91, 92, and that was a boom population of birds. So when you see rats moving ahead of you as you're quail hunting, that is not anything to be scared of. That's something to be excited about. And hopefully those rats will be feeding various snakes, Cooper's hawks, harriers, coyotes, and bobcats more so than quail. I want to invite you to our field day on 25th September, coming up at the Roll Plains Quail Research Ranch. Go to quailresearch.org or follow us on our newsletter or Facebook and find out more about that. Okay, let's move on a little less rosy a forecast, and that's about the quail hunters. So let me ask you a question. How many Texas quail hunters were there in the 2014-15 season? This will be based on Texas Parks and Wildlife data. You can just a minute to contemplate that. And the correct answer was 40,000, roughly 40,000 quail hunters. That's down about 200,000 from 20 years ago. So our numbers have slipped a lot in the quail hunting ranks, and we need to be concerned about that. Now, if you're a recovering deer addict and you want to become a quail hunter, well, I just ask that you repeat this every time you go quail hunting, that every quail is a trophy. That's something that I make sure the deer nuts don't forget. We don't have to have any particular size deer to make it a trophy. Every 6-ounce quail is a trophy. But if you're hung up on Boone and Crockett scoring system, well, I did come up with a Boone and Crockett scoring system for quail hunting several years ago, and that's basically 30 plus 6 times the coveys that you point. So, for example, in February of 2005, Ray Sasser, outdoor writer for the Dallas Morning News, hunted with me down here just north of San Angelo. We pointed 28 coveys in 3.5 hours. And so our score that day would have been a 198. And I asked Ray, I said, do you think that qualifies for a 198? And he said, absolutely. So there should be some 200-point Boone and Crockett quail scores coming up this year, especially down south of Texas. Just to poke a little bit at the deer people, we have a low fawn crop. We have very low fawn recruitment in our hunting population. Most of our quail hunters are 40 or older, and we need to recruit some youngsters. And then we have CWD, chronic wasting disease, in our quail hunters. Our quail hunter numbers, like I said, have declined from roughly 250,000 down to about 40,000. So I encourage you, I exhort you to take some quail hunters. Take 5. Recruit 5 new people into the quail hunting situation this year, and do your part for the sustainability of quail hunting in Texas. All right, let's look ahead a little bit. And from a climatological standpoint, you can check with the Climate Prediction Center and look at their long-range forecast. And the long-range forecast is looking pretty impressive for the quail-producing regions of Texas. Based on what I checked with last Monday, it said there's a greater than 90% chance that El Nino will continue through the northern hemisphere this winter, and around an 80% chance it will last through early spring 2016. So from a weather standpoint, if the folks at NOAA are correct, That's a very, very optimistic forecast for us. And we may be hunting in the mud some this fall, but again, it should pay dividends for us next spring and summer. I hope they're right. I'm anxious to see if we can come up with another good year next year, just what we can see as far as a quail boom. Okay, and then we come to the realization again, it's not layman called it unstable utopia. Can we, if we get this numbers back up to X, can we sustain them? Number one, we probably can't do much about the recruitment. When it turns dry like it did in 2011, we're not going to raise any chicks, or very few. Can we increase the survival of those adult birds? Because one of the main factors that dictates how many birds we've got this fall is how many breeder birds we enter the breeding season with. So one of the things I want you to think about is how can we increase the survival of these birds through the winter and through the summer as we go into that next cycle, next drought cycle, and we know it's on the horizon somewhere. Here's an astute manager from down in South Texas. He's pointing over to those thunderheads. He recognizes the importance of rain, but he knows that his management on the ground is also having an impact too. So I don't have time to go into today all the axe plow, cow fire kind of recommendations, but I've talked about that on some other webinars, and if you follow us on the newsletter, or I'll give you some books in a minute, you can read more about some of those factors. Become conversant with what your various options are, what the various tools are in your quail toolbox. And let's not fall into the trap of resting on our laurels like too often we've done. As Lincoln said, why is it that we never consider rationing until we see the bottom of the barrel? Let's think about rationing. Let's think about those factors now and try to get ahead of the curve to the degree biologically that we can. I'd give you these 3 homework assignments. Learn to appreciate quail. When I say appreciate, I mean judge with heightened awareness and be cautiously or sensitively aware of. To think like a quail. If you've ever been to one of our Quail Masters classes or a Quail Appreciation Day, basically I ask that you assume the physical dimensions of a bobwhite. 6 inches tall, weighs 6 ounces. And look at the world and how that affects your thinking process through that set of eyes. And become a student of quail. And again, I'll share some resources here with you to help you on that journey. A couple of books that if you don't have, I would encourage any student of quail to have. One is Beef, Brush, and Bobwhites, the 2nd edition by Hernandez and Guthrie. Texas Quails, a 2006 book. Lenny Brennan is the editor of that. Both those books are available on your online bookstores. And neither is very expensive. I'm going to say $18 up to maybe $30, something like that. And then this is the new field guide that my colleague Ricky Lennox over at Weatherford with the Natural Resource Conservation Service came out with about 6 months ago. And it's been a bestseller here in North Texas for sure. It was a badly needed field guide, so if you don't have a copy of that, you can go to BRIT, Botanical Research Institute of Texas, BRIT.org, I believe, and you can find out how to order that. And that's a steal, $20 or $25 you order it online. If you can catch Ricky at one of his county offices from your local soil and water conservation district, $20, and that's a veritable steal. Encourage you to follow the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch at quailresearch.org. Again, the newsletter is published on the 1st of every month. We have several YouTube videos, about 25 different YouTube webisodes, and I would solicit ideas from you. If you have some topics that you would like to see addressed in a 3 to 7 minute webisode, well, please get those to me because we'll be producing 4 or 5 more this fall, and I'm always looking for popular topics. There's one of the webisodes. Like I said, there's webisodes on everything from drought and quail to cattle and quail to burning and quail, a lot of different things there. And then finally, I want to invite you to the statewide quail symposium that's being conducted by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife as a result of the Reversing the Decline of Quail Initiative, some special money that was given to Extension 2 years ago. And the culmination of that first biennium will be the statewide quail symposium in Abilene. That's on September 16th to the 18th, so I guess that's a little less than a month from now. You can go to that website and find out registration details. We're going to have a real nice tour starting on that Wednesday afternoon on the Trail Ranch up near Albany, so I certainly invite you to join us for those. And Becky, do you want to make any comments about the Quail Symposium? I invite Becky if you want to add anything about the Quail Initiative. Okay, I'm not hearing Becky, so I'll assume she didn't. All right, Clint, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you ask some questions if I have time.
Sounds good. So far, you're going to get off easy. We only have one that came in, so we've still got some time. I would encourage anybody that has questions, go ahead and post them up in the chat window, and we'll answer them as we go. The one and only question so far is, what effects do wild hogs have on quail populations?
Probably not what you think. You gotta think about this with a little bit of critical thinking skills here. If you think about a wild hog, you're looking at a mammal that probably has the most gifted sense of smell, olfactory capabilities in the mammal world. They used to use them to harvest truffles, underground mushrooms with, because they had such keen sense of smell. So you'd think they'd be an effective predator of quail nest. Now, we've done some studies of this 20 years ago where we'd set out chicken eggs, what we call dummy nests, to try to get a handle on this. And as I recall, we did that in Shackford County and Ford County, and we set out like a total of 1,000 nests over a 2-year period. Of the nests that were destroyed, which is about 60%, we think hogs accounted for anywhere from about 8% to 24% of those. So this is an area that had a lot of hogs, and so we don't think they're as big a factor as what most people would suggest. And then, oddly enough, if you think about the soil disturbance that hogs do, they are indeed the original root plow. And so anywhere the hogs have been foraging at, digging under cactus or otherwise digging for grubs or whatever, and that's where you get your sunflowers, your snow on the mountain, some of those early successional forbs. So it's not easy arithmetic. A lot of people would like to say, nuke the hogs and we'll all be better off for it. I challenge you to document that. Hogs are something that, again, the numbers have exploded over the last 20 years, but to this point, you'd be hard-pressed to document that there's been an impact on quail at the population level.
Okay. The next question, what are your thoughts about federal upland game bird stamp? About a federal upland game bird stamp?
I hadn't given that a whole lot of thought. I guess my initial off the cuff, I'd want to know, where's the money going? How's it going to be used? Quail are not a migratory species, so I'm not sure. I'll defer on that. I don't have a strong sense right now, a strong opinion on that either way. I'd have to find out more about it.
Okay. Many ranchers in South Texas are understocked due to previous drought and recent rains. Many ranchers in South Texas are understocked due to previous drought, and the recent rains have provided large amounts of forage, i.e. buffalo grass. Would you recommend patch burning or any other management practice to open some areas up?
Yes, judicious grazing can be a powerful positive tool. When I say judicious, you got to make a distinction between having cows and quail at the same time and using cows as a tool for quail management. You mentioned the patch burn grazing. That's one way to focus where your grazing is going to occur in that landscape. And at least theoretically, it sounds like a great tool. I don't know if enough of it's been done right now to say we see a population response, but we can do some small-scale grass sculpting, if you'll let me coin that phrase, with that patch burn grazing. We've done some of it there at the Quail Research Ranch. The country looked wonderful. At the end of it, we did that from 9 through 11, and then we drowned it out in 2011. Our country looked good throughout, but our quail numbers dropped off pretty severely, and they dropped off worse in our 2 patch burn graze pastures than the rest of the ranch. So I'm hard-pressed to explain that. Down in South Texas, where you got exotic grasses like buffalo grass, and they're having a problem on some of the ranches with one called tanglehead, and several other exotic grasses, where basically, if there's anything that you can do to hit those grasses hard and then pull off at a strategic time or when it might favor your native species, that would be a beneficial tool to have in your toolbox. I know that Cesar Kleberg Institute has looked at some of those practices down there. I know they've looked at it as a possible tool for the tanglehead issue. I don't think they've found the cure for that just yet, but the grazing would be one of the tools you'd want to consider.
Okay. This gentleman asked, what ranches did you in South Texas, and what were your specific observations on quail populations?
Well, for the sake of privacy of our landowners, I'm not going to give you the specific names, but I was within roughly a 30-mile circle of Hebronville and toured 4 different properties. Some of them a little less sandy soils, and some of the two of the sides for sandier soils than the other one. And a sandy soil, if you have your druthers, you want a sandy soil. You don't have to fight the brush quite as hard on some of those finer sandy soils like you do if it's got clay loam soils. So what was the rest of your question? Specific?
What were your specific observations on quail populations?
Well, I can see why the folks down there were giving it 9s and 10s. We saw a lot of birds when we'd be out touring, roughly from 8 o'clock until 10 o'clock in the morning. We were seeing a lot of quail, enough to excite any quail hunter. I can assure you that. If we were touring in the mid-afternoon, of course, because we were having 105-degree weather, we didn't see as many quail then. But the conditions, it's thick. It's pretty thick. I mean, you better have a dang good retriever with you this year because, and I'd be hesitant to even try to shoot 2 birds on the rise. I think you shoot 1 bird, you go to it, you get it, and go on to the next one kind of thing. Because finding birds in that kind of country, or in North Texas, in our broomweed situation, a good retriever is going to be literally man's best friend this year.
Okay. Still thinking South Texas. This person says they're fighting tanglehead. Is there any benefit to the grass for quail or benefit to late summer manipulation of the grass area?
Well, when I look at and I'm not a tanglehead expert by any means, all I know is what I see in South Texas. It has the same structural growth as little bluestem. So from that standpoint, structurally, it looks like it's a pretty dang decent nesting cover to me. And I heard one of the measures, I guess what I discerned from his comments were that he's not nearly as concerned about it as he was 3 or 4 years ago because he thinks it can be important nesting cover, especially during dry weather. Having said that, again, a lot of these areas and a lot of concern by my colleagues about exotic grasses in general just taking over the landscape kind of thing. And so, again, grazing is going to have to be a component. Some people would argue that because of the shift in grazing practices due to quail or wildlife in general, in other words, it's not grazed as hard. Ranches are not grazed as hard, certainly as they were 15 years or more ago. And that may have, quote unquote, released some of that tanglehead and bufflegrass where it becomes more problematic. Given a year like we've had with rainfall like this, I'm not sure you could have enough cattle on there right now. And then again, you've got to be able to liquidate those cattle when you need to from a habitat standpoint. So my point there, I guess, is like we've always said in range management, be flexible with the stocking rates. If you've got a cow-calf operation, maybe stock 50 to 70% of your grazing capacity with cows, and the remainder of that with stocker animals that can be more fluid in the management program.
Okay. Do you think the increased number of properties in wildlife management as opposed to traditional ag has had a positive impact on usable space for quail in some areas, or any impact at all?
I would say it's had some impact, and I would say in most areas that impact has been positive. A possible exception to that, again, would be South Texas, and again, in a year of 2 or 3 good rainfall years where your grass can get too thick. Here in West Texas, when somebody tells me, that grass can get too thick for quail, I would just say, yeah, I think I've seen it once in my career, and that was in the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. I'm typically not worried about grass getting too thick for quail in West Texas. But again, South Texas, when you get the kind of rains they've had down there the last 2 summers, they get pretty thick. So the cattle are going to be much more of an important tool in your toolkit in those areas that receive over 25 inches rainfall than in areas where you receive typically less than 25 inches rainfall.
Okay, this person asks, do you conduct insect sweeps in the spring? If so, do you think they're a good indicator of quail nesting success for that year?
At the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch, we only sample arthropods insects one time, and that's during the month of July. So I don't think sweep netting, if you said in April, you're not going to catch very many. There's not very many, certainly not very many grasshoppers out there. Most of those that are important to us for chick diets are probably coming on in late May and here in North Texas. One of the things that we've tried to do, we're doing it right now, is put hairy vetch in some of our strip discs and plantings, because it's been my experience that hairy vetch, it comes on typically in April, and it kind of jump starts the bug population. And so we're anxious to see if we can document that. But at this point in time, we've never done any April sweetening.
Okay, speaking of chicks, this person says they have been seeing a lot of very young birds on their place. Should they wait until later in the season to hunt? And also, how does a landowner know what constitutes a responsible harvest?
Well, the first one about seeing chicks, again, there are some years I know in, I think it was about 2009 or 10, that South Texas could get a tropical depression about right now, and again have birds hatching off into late September, October time frame, and have birds that were hatching during hunting season. So you just have to do some type of counts, either roadside counts or whatever, to get some idea of that. We generally don't have a problem with that further north or further west. So as a rule, our birds are mature, 10 weeks old or so, by the time hunting season will begin. And either visit with your local biologist or, again, do some of your own investigation. I would recommend roadside counts in September as a pretty good index to that. And the other question, I'm sorry, Tim, was what?
How does a landowner know what constitutes a responsible harvest?
Well, I deal with people that basically say, kill all you want, we'll make more, to only shoot them in the very best of years. And even a year like this year, they'd say, one bird per covey and move on kind of thing. I don't have a good rule of thumb for that. That's at the conscience of the quail hunter. As a rule, let me just think about this a minute. Don't be hesitant as a landowner. If you were going into a year like last year, for example, when our numbers were pretty good in certain areas, but they were surely on the rebound. If you wanted to say state limit is 15 birds a day, if you want to cut it down, you have the flexibility to do that. The state's not going to do that. They're not going to restrict the season. But you as a landowner, if you deem that's important, I would encourage you to work with your quail hunters, especially if they're in it on the long haul with you, and involve those individuals in that decision and try to come to some mutual agreement on that. One of the things that I do, me and my hunting buddy does often, is we play what I call quail snooker. We only shoot the roosters. And people say, oh, boy, you can't do that. With bobwhites, you can do that. We set a 2-hen limit on ourselves. And so if on our best day that I can recall, we had 28 birds and 3 of them were hens. So if you begin to look for the white face on that bobwhite rooster, you can do it if you learn to play the light right. And I promise you it'll make you a better shot, because just like a bow hunter, you're focusing in on a particular point on that animal, and you'll become a better shot by doing that. Not recommend it for everybody, but for those of you who think you're in an advanced quail career, try a couple of games of quail snooker.
All right, one last question we have. When do you think the earliest hatches occur?
The earliest hatches here in North Texas typically don't happen before about the second week of May. Everything was 3 weeks early this year. The first nest we recorded, as I recall, was like hatching. It was like May 18th. South Texas probably, again, would have been a month ahead of that, maybe 6 weeks. But every year you will get somebody reporting that they saw chicks here in North Texas they might have seen chicks middle of March. I'm not doubting that that's impossible. I have some speculation about how that can happen, especially if you've got a lot of adult birds in your population. I think the pair bond for them may be intact, and so they avoid the dating game and they get on with making hay early in the season. But that's speculation on my part. Typically, you're going to make or break a quail crop with a June hatch. This year, a little bit earlier than that. So mid-May to late June, we probably had 70% of the inspection.